The sound of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Daisy Fletcher ducked behind a water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs like a blacksmith's hammer. She hadn't expected her first day in this frontier town to include a shootout, but then again, nothing about her journey west had gone according to plan. "Stay down, miss." A deep voice commanded as a tall figure dove beside her, the brim of his hat pulled low over piercing blue eyes. Dust swirled around them as more shots rang out. Daisy clutched her carpet bag tighter, the few possessions she owned in the world contained within its worn fabric. "What's happening?" she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "Just another Tuesday in Willow Creek," the stranger replied with surprising calm. He peered over the edge of the trough, his revolver steady in his hand. "Name's Mason Keller. I'd say it's a pleasure to meet you, but circumstances being what they are." He offered a quick, disarming smile that caught Daisy off guard. It was April 1879, and Daisy Fletcher was 22 years old with nothing but determination and a teaching certificate to her name. She'd traveled all the way from Boston to take a position at the newly established schoolhouse, hoping to leave behind the painful memories of her parents' deaths and the financial ruin that followed. "I'm Daisy Fletcher, the new schoolteacher," she managed to say between the sounds of breaking glass and shouting men. "This isn't exactly the welcome I anticipated." Mason's eyes widened slightly. "The schoolteacher, we've been expecting you." He glanced around quickly. "This ruckus is courtesy of the Dawson brothers. They've been causing trouble since they rode in last week." Another volley of shots peppered the building across the street, and Mason pressed Daisy lower behind their shelter. She couldn't help noticing the strength in his arm or the scent of leather and pine that clung to his denim shirt. "When I count to 3, Mason instructed, "we're going to run to that alley. Ready?" Before Daisy could protest that she absolutely was not ready, Mason counted quickly, and suddenly she was being pulled to her feet, racing across the dusty street with her skirts bunched in one hand and her carpet bag in the other. They reached the safety of the alley, both breathing hard. "The schoolhouse is just 2 blocks from here," Mason explained. "I'll get you there safely, Miss Fletcher." "I can manage from here," Daisy insisted, attempting to regain some dignity as she straightened her travel-worn dress. "I'm not some helpless damsel." A hint of amusement crossed Mason's weathered face. "Never suggested you were, but a gentleman doesn't leave a lady to fend for herself when the Dawson brothers are shooting up the town." As they cautiously made their way toward the schoolhouse, Daisy took her first real look at Mason Keller. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the western sky. His light brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and despite his rugged appearance, there was a gentleness in his eyes that caught her by surprise. "Are you the town sheriff?" she asked, noticing the confident way he carried his weapon. Mason laughed, a warm sound that seemed at odds with the chaos they'd just escaped. "No, madam, just a rancher with the misfortune of needing supplies on the same day you arrived." "Sheriff Thornton's likely at the other end of town trying to corral those troublemakers." They rounded a corner, and Daisy saw a modest white building with a small bell tower. "The schoolhouse," Mason announced, unnecessary but with evident pride. "Built it last summer. The town pitched in." "You helped build it?" Daisy asked, surprised. "Yes, madam. My ranch is about 5 miles outside town, but I believe in education. My mother was a teacher back east." Something in his voice softened at the mention of his mother. A woman with silver-streaked hair emerged from the schoolhouse, waving frantically. "You must be Miss Fletcher. Thank goodness you're safe. We heard the commotion in town." "Mrs. Abernathy," Mason nodded respectfully. "Found Miss Fletcher in the middle of the Dawsons' latest disagreement with the saloon owner." Mrs. Abernathy clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "What a terrible first impression of our town. Come inside, dear. I've prepared the teacher's quarters for you." Daisy turned to thank Mason, suddenly feeling reluctant to part ways with the man who'd helped her through her chaotic arrival. "Will I see you again, Mr. Keller?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. Mason touched the brim of his hat, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Count on it, Miss Fletcher. I've got 2 young siblings who will be in your classroom come Monday." He mounted his horse, which had been tethered nearby. "Welcome to Willow Creek." As he rode away, Daisy couldn't help but watch his retreating figure, wondering what kind of place she'd committed herself to for the next year. The teacher's quarters proved to be a small but clean room attached to the back of the schoolhouse, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a pot-bellied stove for the cold months. Mrs. Abernathy, who served on the town council, helped Daisy settle in and explained her duties. 27 children, ages 5 to 16, the older woman said. Some can only attend when farm chores permit, especially during planting and harvest. The town provides your salary and this accommodation, modest though it is. "It's perfect," Daisy assured her, though it was a far cry from her family's once elegant Boston home. Before her father's investments had failed and illness had claimed both her parents within months of each other, Daisy had expected a very different future for herself, perhaps marriage to one of Boston's eligible young businessmen, a comfortable home, children of her own. Instead, she found herself alone, nearly penniless and desperate for a fresh start. That evening, after Mrs. Abernathy had gone, Daisy sat on her bed and finally allowed herself a moment of doubt. The sound of distant piano music drifted from the saloon, mingling with occasional shouts and laughter. This rough-edged town was nothing like the civilized world she'd left behind. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, unpacking the few books she'd brought, Shakespeare, Emerson, and her Bible. One day at a time. Monday morning arrived with bright sunshine and the nervous flutter of anticipation in Daisy's stomach. She'd spent the weekend preparing the classroom and familiarizing herself with the town. Sheriff Thornton had restored order, and the Dawson brothers had apparently moved on to cause trouble elsewhere. As the children began to arrive, Daisy stood at the schoolhouse door in her best dress, greeting each one with a smile. Some were shy, others boldly curious about their new teacher from the East. Among the last to arrive were 2 children with familiar blue eyes, a boy of about 14 and a girl who looked to be 10 or 11. "Miss Fletcher," the boy said with a tip of his hat that mimicked his older brother's gesture, "I'm Michael Keller, and this is my sister Sarah. Our brother Mason said to give you his regards." "Thank you, Michael," Daisy replied, trying not to show how pleased she was to hear Mason's name. "I'm very glad to meet you both." Sarah, with her long brown braids and freckled nose, looked up at Daisy with undisguised admiration. "Are you really from Boston? Do ladies there wear fancy dresses every day?" Daisy laughed. "Not every day, but perhaps more often than is practical out here." She ushered the children inside, wondering if their brother might appear at the end of the school day. Her first week of teaching passed in a blur of names, lessons, and adjustments to frontier life. The children proved eager to learn, though their previous education had been inconsistent at best. By Friday, Daisy had assessed their abilities and begun to develop a teaching plan that would challenge the advanced students while helping those who needed extra attention. She was erasing the chalkboard after dismissal when a knock at the door made her turn. Mason Keller stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat more polished than he had during their first meeting. His shirt was clean, his hair neatly combed, and he'd clearly made an effort to scrape the ranch dust from his boots. "Mr. Keller," Daisy said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "What brings you to town?" "Came to fetch Michael and Sarah," he replied, stepping into the classroom, "and to ask how they are behaving for their new teacher. They're wonderful students. Michael has a gift for mathematics, and Sarah's reading comprehension is remarkable for her age." Pride softened Mason's features. "Our mother taught them their letters before she passed. I've tried to keep them learning, but—" He gestured around the classroom. "This is better than anything I could provide. How long has your mother been gone?" Daisy asked gently. 3 years now. Fever took her. Father died in a mining accident 2 years before that. His voice was matter of fact, but Daisy recognized the look of someone who had shouldered responsibilities far too young. Been raising the young'uns since then, building up the ranch. That's admirable, Daisy said sincerely. They're a credit to you. Mason studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Michael says you've been having the older students help teach the younger ones. Daisy nodded. It reinforces their own learning and gives me time to work with different groups. There's such a wide range of abilities. Smart approach, Mason approved. Listen, Miss Fletcher, there's a social at the church tomorrow evening, sort of a welcome for you and a way to meet more of the community. Would you consider attending, as my guest? The invitation caught Daisy off guard. In Boston, such an invitation would have carried significant social implications. Here in Willow Creek, she wasn't certain of the customs. That's very kind, Mr. Keller, but I wouldn't want to impose on your family obligations. Surely you need to bring Michael and Sarah. Mason smiled. They're coming too, with the Abernathys. I thought you might appreciate having someone to escort you, being new to town and all. Put that way, it seemed a perfectly reasonable arrangement. Then I accept, Mr. Keller, thank you. Mason, he corrected. If we're going to be friends, you might as well use my given name. Daisy, she offered in return, feeling a small thrill at the easy way he spoke of friendship. Daisy, he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. I'll call for you at 6 tomorrow. After he left, Daisy found herself moving through the room with a new lightness in her step. It was just a community gathering, she reminded herself. Nothing more than a neighborly gesture from a man who clearly valued education and wanted to help the new schoolteacher feel welcome. So why couldn't she stop smiling? The church social proved to be exactly what Daisy needed to feel part of the community. The town's residents welcomed her warmly, eager to meet the woman entrusted with their children's education. Mason stayed attentively by her side, introducing her to ranchers, shopkeepers, and families whose names she struggled to commit to memory all at once. Everyone's been so kind, Daisy remarked as Mason handed her a cup of punch. They had stepped outside for a moment, the spring evening pleasantly cool after the warmth of the crowded church hall. Folks here understand the value of a good teacher, Mason replied. Most of them didn't have much schooling themselves. They want better for their children. A fiddle struck up inside, and the sounds of furniture being moved suggested dancing was about to begin. Mason set down his cup and extended his hand. Would you care to dance, Miss Fletcher? Daisy hesitated. I should warn you, my dancing experience is limited to formal Boston ballrooms. I'm not familiar with your Western reels. Then, I'll have the pleasure of teaching you something for a change, Mason said with a grin that made Daisy's heart skip. He led her inside, where couples were already forming lines for a Virginia reel. The dance was lively and far less rigid than what Daisy was accustomed to. She found herself laughing as Mason guided her through the steps, his hand warm and steady when it met hers. By the time the music ended, her cheeks were flushed and a few tendrils of hair had escaped her careful arrangement. You're a natural, Mason told her as they caught their breath. You're too kind, Daisy replied, but I enjoyed it immensely. As the weeks passed, Daisy settled into life in Willow Creek. Her students made progress that filled her with pride, and she found unexpected satisfaction in the simplicity of frontier life. The town had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had after her parents' deaths. Mason became a regular visitor to the schoolhouse, often bringing books for her small library or stopping by to repair something that needed fixing. Their friendship grew naturally, founded on mutual respect and enjoyment of each other's company. Sometimes he would bring her wildflowers he'd gathered on his ride to town, presenting them with a casual thought these might brighten your desk, schoolteacher. June brought the end of the school term and the beginning of summer's heat. Most of the children would be needed for farm work until harvest was complete. though Daisy had arranged weekly reading sessions for those who could attend. On the last day of school, Mason arrived with his wagon instead of his horse. "Thought you might like to see a bit more of the territory," he suggested. "The children are having a picnic by the creek, and Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you haven't ventured far from town yet." The idea was appealing. After months in the small schoolhouse, Daisy longed for open spaces. "I'd love that, but I should help supervise the children. Already arranged, Mrs. Abernathy and some of the mothers have it well in hand. This would be just for the afternoon, after the school picnic." Something in his expression, a mixture of hope and vulnerability, made it impossible to refuse. "In that case, I accept." After the children's picnic concluded with much laughter and a few tears at saying goodbye for the summer, Mason helped Daisy into his wagon. "I want to show you my ranch," he said as they left town behind, "if that's agreeable." The Rolling K Ranch, as Mason called it, was situated in a verdant valley with a creek running through it. The main house was modest but solid, with a wide porch and climbing roses that reminded Daisy of illustrations she'd seen of English cottages. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely as he helped her down from the wagon. "Been working on it for 5 years now," Mason said with evident pride. "Started with just the cabin over there." He pointed to a smaller structure nearby. "Built this house for Mother, though she didn't get much time to enjoy it." He showed her the barn, the corrals, and the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "Not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's growing. Another few years, and it'll be something to be proud of." "It's already something to be proud of," Daisy assured him. "You've accomplished so much, especially considering you've been raising Michael and Sarah." They walked to a hilltop that overlooked the entire valley. The June sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows and gilding the landscape. Mason spread a blanket on the grass and produced a basket of food. "Mrs. Abernathy sent this along," he explained. "Said a growing boy like me probably forgot to plan for refreshments." Daisy laughed. "She's very thoughtful." As they shared bread, cheese, and early summer berries, their conversation flowed easily from books they'd read to dreams they harbored. Mason spoke of expanding his herd, perhaps adding sheep if the market remained strong. Daisy confessed her hope to someday start a proper library for the town. "You've changed things for the better here," Mason said, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Not just for the children, but for the whole community." "I've only been doing my job," Daisy demurred. Mason shook his head. "It's more than that. You've brought something we didn't even know we were missing." The sincerity in his voice made Daisy look away, afraid he might see the feelings she'd been carefully guarding. Over the past months, her admiration for Mason had deepened into something far more complicated. His kindness, his integrity, the gentle way he guided his younger siblings all had combined to create an attachment she hadn't intended but could no longer deny. "Will you stay?" Mason asked suddenly. "After your year is up," the question caught her by surprise. "I haven't decided," she answered honestly. "I've grown fond of Willow Creek, but it's not Boston," he finished for her. "Not the life you were raised to expect." "That life is gone," Daisy said softly. "My parents are home. The social position I once took for granted, none of that exists anymore. Coming west was my fresh start." Mason reached across the blanket and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "What if you found reasons to make this your home, permanent-like?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Daisy's heart raced, but caution held her tongue. She had lost too much, too quickly in the past. The idea of risking her heart again, especially in this wild country where life was so uncertain, terrified her. "I should think very carefully about such a decision," she finally said. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I respect that. Just know that there are people here who care deeply about what you decide." The emphasis on people made it clear he was speaking primarily of himself. As summer progressed, Daisy found herself spending more time at the Rolling K. Sometimes she would bring books to read with Sarah and Michael, or help with preserving the garden's bounty for winter. Other times, she and Mason would ride out to check the cattle, her initially tentative horsemanship improving under his patient instruction. On a warm August evening, they sat on the porch swing after dinner, the air heavy with the scent of roses and the sound of crickets. Michael and Sarah had gone inside to finish their chores, leaving Daisy and Mason in a comfortable silence broken only by the creaking of the swing. "I've been thinking," Mason said finally, his voice low, "about the future." Daisy's heart quickened. "Oh." Michael's almost ready to take on more responsibility here. Another year or two, and he could manage if I needed to be away more. "Away?" Daisy asked, confused by this unexpected turn in the conversation. Mason turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Town's growing. Sheriff Thornton's getting on in years and has been looking for a deputy, someone who might eventually take his place." Understanding dawned. "You're considering becoming a lawman," Mason nodded. "It would mean a steady wage in addition to what the ranch brings in. More security for the future. For a family." The word family hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. "Mason," Daisy began cautiously, "are you planning these changes for yourself or for some other reason?" He took her hand, his gaze steady. "I think you know the answer to that, Daisy. I've never been one for fancy words or poetry, but these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I find myself thinking about the future in ways I never did before." Daisy's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you. That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The words she'd both hoped for and feared washed over her. She loved him too, had known it for some time, but the old fears persisted. "Mason, I care for you deeply, but marriage is such a serious commitment. How can we be certain?" "Some things you just know," he said simply. "I knew the first time I saw you ducking behind that water trough, looking terrified but determined. I knew when I watched you with the children, patient and kind even with the most difficult ones. I've known every day since." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I've lost everyone I ever loved, my parents, my home, everything familiar, the thought of risking my heart again." Mason gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. That's not the way life works, especially out here. But I can promise that as long as I draw breath, you won't face anything alone again." In that moment, Daisy knew her decision was already made. The life she'd left behind in Boston had been a pale shadow compared to the vibrant reality she'd found here, with this man who embodied everything good and true about the frontier spirit. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both monumental and completely natural. Mason's face lit with a joy so pure it took her breath away. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, worn at the edges but carefully preserved. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl. "She made me promise I'd give it only to a woman who was as strong and kind as she was. I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Daisy stared at the ring, suddenly overwhelmed. The permanence of what they were discussing hit her full force. "Mason, I need time. This is happening so fast." "Too fast?" he asked, concern replacing the joy in his eyes. "I just need to be sure," she explained. "For both our sakes, marriage isn't something to enter into lightly." Mason closed the box, disappointment evident in the slump of his shoulders but respect in his nod. "I understand, I shouldn't have rushed you." "No, it's not that," Daisy hastened to assure him. "My feelings for you are real and true. I just need a little time to be certain this is the right path for both of us." The school term resumed in September, bringing Daisy back to her routine of lessons and community involvement. Mason remained a steadfast presence in her life, never pressuring her about his proposal, but making his feelings clear in countless small ways, repairing her roof before the autumn rains, bringing books he thought she might enjoy, teaching her to shoot a rifle just in case. As harvest time approached, Willow Creek prepared for its annual harvest festival, a celebration that brought together the entire community for food, dancing, and Thanksgiving for the year's bounty. The town square was decorated with autumn leaves and bunting, tables groaning with food contributed by every household. Daisy found herself at the center of much attention, with parents eager to discuss their children's progress and young, unmarried men hoping for a dance. Through it all, Mason watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. When the dancing began, he finally approached her. "May I have this dance, Miss Fletcher?" he asked formally, as if they were strangers rather than two people who had shared their deepest feelings. "Of course, Mr. Keller," she responded in kind, allowing him to lead her into a waltz. As they moved together, the familiar warmth of his hand at her waist reminded Daisy of all they had shared over the past months. The distance that had grown between them since his proposal suddenly seemed intolerable. "I've missed you," she said softly. Mason's step faltered slightly. "I've been right here." "But not really," Daisy countered. "Not like before." The music ended, and Mason led her to the edge of the dance floor. "Walk with me," he asked, gesturing toward the quieter streets beyond the celebration. They strolled in silence for a while, the sounds of the festival fading behind them. When they reached the schoolhouse, Mason stopped. "This is where it all began," he said. "Where I started to believe in possibilities I'd given up on." Daisy looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. "What possibilities? A partner, someone to share the burden and the joy. Someone who sees the world in books and ideas, while I see it in land and cattle. Someone who makes me better than I am on my own." The simple honesty of his words pierced Daisy's remaining doubts. The fears that had held her back of loss, of uncertainty, of a future in this untamed territory seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the certainty of Mason's love and the life they could build together. "I don't need any more time," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I know what I want," Mason's breath caught. "And what's that? You, this town, the life we can make together." Joy blazed across his features. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the velvet box. "Daisy Fletcher, will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children." As he opened the box, revealing the pearl ring that had once belonged to his mother, Daisy felt a last flicker of fear, not of accepting, but of all that could be lost if she dared to love so completely again. "Mason, she began, her voice catching. Before she could give voice to her momentary hesitation, Mason gently took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. The perfect fit seemed a sign, the weight of it both strange and right against her skin. "There," he said softly. "Now tell me your answer while wearing my mother's ring. If it's no, I'll understand, but I want you to feel what it would be like to be mine, just for a moment." The gesture, presumptuous yet tender, broke through Daisy's final reservations. This man, who had rebuilt his life after loss just as she was attempting to do, understood her fears because he shared them. Yet he had found the courage to love again, to risk his heart despite knowing the pain that could come. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Mason Keller. I will marry you." His whoop of joy echoed through the quiet street as he lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down and capturing her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of passion and partnership. They were married in the church on Christmas Eve, with Michael standing proudly as his brother's best man and Sarah serving as Daisy's maid of honor. The entire town turned out to celebrate the union of their schoolteacher and the rancher who had helped build their community. As they exchanged vows, Daisy looked at the ring on her finger, the one Mason had slipped on, before she could voice her doubts, and silently thanked him for his gentle persistence. In the end, it wasn't his words that had convinced her, but his actions. The consistent love he showed her, his siblings, and their town day after day. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you for saying yes," he whispered against her lips. "Thank you for not letting me say no," she whispered back, smiling through happy tears. They moved into the ranch house, which no longer seemed modest to Daisy but perfect for the family they hoped to build. Michael and Sarah welcomed her as if she had always belonged with them, and together they created a home filled with books, music, and laughter. The following spring, Daisy continued teaching while helping Mason with the ranch accounts. When Sheriff Thornton officially asked Mason to become his deputy, they discussed the opportunity thoroughly before agreeing it was right for their future. A year after their wedding, as winter gave way to the promise of spring once more, Daisy shared news that completed their joy. They would welcome a child when the autumn leaves began to fall. Mason's response was to build a nursery adjoining their bedroom and to plant a garden of wildflowers, so our little one knows the beauty of this land from the start. On a perfect September day, with golden light streaming through the bedroom window, their daughter came into the world with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. They named her Hope, a testament to the future they had dared to believe in despite the losses of their pasts. As Daisy nursed their infant daughter, while Mason read aloud from Shakespeare, his voice stumbling occasionally over the unfamiliar words, but persevering for her sake, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the frightened young woman hiding behind a water trough on her first day in Willow Creek to the contented wife and mother she had become, each step had led her exactly where she was meant to be. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason asked suddenly, setting aside the book. "Staying here instead of returning to civilization back east." Daisy looked around at the home they had built together, at the man who had slipped a ring on her finger when she hesitated, giving her the courage to embrace the love he offered. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "This is where I belong. This is my home." Outside their window, the vast western sky stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a reminder of the open future that awaited them, a future built on love, determination, and the courage to begin again.